Hello, UCAR. Peter Christensen here, coming to you from the CEO's desk. We're going to talk about the situation where you have a seller who needs to stay in the property for a little longer. Now, what is a little longer? It's different every time, right? And how long it is might determine what method you use to address that. So you got a couple options, right? Right in the REPSI, you can indicate when possession will take place. So you could put in there days, hours, and give the seller a little time after settlement, right, to go ahead and occupy the property. Because, once it becomes technically the buyer's property, you have to address when does the seller have to leave, how quickly. So should be a topic of conversation during the negotiations. But let's say seller says, I want to stay. Is it better to address it just right there in the REPSI? And what are the limitations? Because we also have this form called the short-term leaseback addendum that's made for just this scenario, right? It's when a seller wants to stay. But it's also a 3-page form. It's got some formality to it. Formality, get it? And so is it overkill? Is it necessary? Well, I know a lot of buyers and sellers choose to just address it in the REPSI, and maybe it's 72 hours, maybe it's 24 hours. The seller just needs a little time, and that's fine. And could you use it for even 5 days in the REPSI? Well, I think legally you can, but there are some downsides. First of all, the longer a seller stays in a property that they no longer own, the higher the likelihood something happens that could be problematic between the parties. So damages, change, something goes wrong in the property, who's responsible for it? The seller thinks they're leaving in 72 hours but ends up staying for 4 days because whatever the home they're buying got held up. Something along those lines. And so those are things that can be addressed in the short-term leaseback. So it's a little more robust. So here are a couple of reasons why, a couple benefits to using the short-term leaseback. First of all, you specify a term, right? And you kind of would too in the REPSI, but you specify a term, so you give a date. This is the date, and seller, you need to be gone. Second benefit is utilities. It talks right in there about which party will be responsible for which utilities, what happens if they have to be switched into the buyer's name because title triggers that, a title change triggers that. That's all addressed in here. Those are things you might not be thinking about when it's 2-3 days, maybe bleeds into 4 or 5 days. Who's paying for that? You can establish a rent, right? And I know a lot of times buyers trying to do seller a favor, maybe even coax seller into picking them so they allow them and they don't want to charge them. But you have the ability to charge them. And then security deposit. So what happens if you're not going to charge rent? Maybe you at least put a security deposit in there to say, okay, if there are damages, this is how we'll address it. Because once money has changed hands between the buyer and the seller, you're then trying to chase that seller down if something went wrong. Some damage occurred in the property, you're trying to chase them down and get that money after the fact, after they're gone, after they've paid. Well, that's a lot harder to do than recover through a security deposit. It gives the buyer a right of entry. That's always a big question mark, right? I own the property now. I've paid for it. I have title, but I want to come in and maybe start setting some stuff up for when I move in, but seller's still occupying. But if I don't start it this week, then it's a holiday and it'll push me back 2 weeks in getting my internet set up or my whatever. It gives the buyer certain rights of entry. And then I really like this one. So let's say you have that scenario where you say, we're doing a seller a favor, letting them stay in there, and we're not going to charge them rent. Well, the reason lawyers like there to be a rental amount in there is because the law is built that if the tenant, which is seller, becomes a tenant in this situation, if they hold over, if they stay in the property longer, then there are penalties, and it's what we call treble damages, which is just tripling the prorated daily amount of rent that they were paying. Well, I can do that math. 3 times 0 is still 0, right? So as a buyer, when they don't leave, you don't have a great method of determining what your damages are. But if you put in Section 9 of that short-term leaseback addendum, you put in an amount. It says if we put 0 for rent, okay, we'll give you the 5 days, the 7 days free. But if you stay after that, we're just going to establish a penalty right in here. So then you're not upsetting the seller and saying, I want to charge you for this. But you're saying, I'll give you the favor, but if you got to give me something, if you stay longer, there's a penalty. So those are some highlights. Maybe in a video we'll go over this form in depth, but I just kind of wanted to talk about the scenario where maybe you have that seller staying over, wanting to stay in the property, and you're not sure, do I use the short-term lease back addendum, or do I just put it in the REPC? So the REPC doesn't give you any more protections. It just gives you the standard protection. Yes, you have a contract. Yes, you could go in and enforce that eventually and kick them out, but it doesn't deal with utilities. It doesn't deal with damages. It doesn't deal with holdover rent, anything like that. Those are all protections for a buyer in the short-term leaseback agreement. So consider it. I always think, for me personally, the longer a seller wants to stay in there, the more inclined I would be to want to use this short-term leaseback agreement, because it gives you a lot more protections and the likelihood of things going wrong grows. So that's it. Remember, this is not legal advice. This is legal information only. If you need specific legal advice, please contact your attorney. Thanks for tuning in.